Hey guys, this is John. I'm here with Game 3 analysis from the 2018 World Chess Championship in London, England. We had our first color repetition of the match today, as Fabiano again has the white pieces after having white in Game 1. That's how it works, you alternate colors. Except for the middle part of the match, Magnus will get double white because he's black in Game 1 and Game 12. And I mention that because in matches, especially at the World Championship level, there's a ton of speculation as to whether the players will repeat openings that they played earlier in the match. And I'm sure among the players themselves, there's a ton of mind games being played about whether to go into the same openings. So, with Fabiano again having white, he opens with e4 again, and we have a repetition of game 1 up until move 6. That's where they deviate. But Magnus again goes for the Sicilian, and that surprised me. I thought he would go to e5 and play the double king pawn opening. That's kind of old reliable for him after e4, but no, he plays the often uncompromising Sicilian defense. Knight f3, knight c6, bishop b5, the Rosslimo variation once again. Still waiting to see if d4 is played, c takes d4, knight takes d4, what Magnus has in mind in the open Sicilian here. Maybe we'll find out. But Fabiano sticks with the Rosslimo, g6, bishop takes c6, and again Magnus captures away from the center, d takes c6, as often happens in this line. Black enhances his control over the d4 square. Also liberates this bishop, and with bishop g7 coming, very hard for white to do anything in the center for the moment. So Fabiano plays d3, and then bishop g7. And now in game 1, Fabiano played h3 here, which is a useful move, and it stops bishop g4. But this time, no preparatory move, he just castles. Just gets his king to safety immediately. And now in game 2, with Fabiano as black and that Queen's Gambit declined, we saw Fabiano getting the first opening surprise in with that rook d8 move, and that proved to be very effective and set the tone for the rest of the game. This time Magnus gets the first opening surprise in, but I don't think it was that great of a move. So he plays queen c7 here, which is a very rare move. I think my database called up 16 examples of it or something, of the hundreds of games that have been played here. Not as rare as rook d8 in that QGD, but still comparatively rare. Other moves that are more popular are knight f6, e5, which, this is the structure that Magnus ends up getting in the present game here and also in game 1. Also bishop g4. Black can definitely make good on this bishop g4 threat. Even moves like b6 and knight h6, believe it or not, are more popular than queen c7. I think what queen c7 is intended to do is stop e5 for one thing, kind of reinforce that square. You'll see that he does play pawn e5 coming up. I heard this characterized as like a high-class waiting move by a couple people. So probably more than anything else, it is surprise value and just trying to get Fabiano out of his concrete prep. So Fabiano responds with rook e1. So this has in mind the idea of pushing this pawn, because if white could get that pawn to e5, that might be useful in blocking this bishop. So rook e1 carries with it that threat. But Magnus shuts that down. He plays e5. And now I mentioned in my analysis of game 1, and if you want to check that out, go click on that video. I'll link it below in the description, that white often does play on the queen side in this Rosslimo structure. So white has options of trying to get pawn b4 in, sometimes even as a pawn sacrifice. So in game 1, Fabiano's rook was still on f1, and he had played that h3 move, and he went knight h2 and then pushed f4 and kind of concentrated on the king side. But here, he decides to hit on the other flank, so he plays a3 with the idea of pushing b4. And Magnus responded with knight f6, just continuing to develop. Interestingly, Magnus doesn't try to prevent b4. To me, a5 makes more sense, as I'm sure a lot of people considered, and probably Magnus considered himself. Which does prevent b4. If b4 takes and there's this unpleasant pin down the a file, white can't recapture with this pawn. I did see that there was one game to have been played with a5 here. This is a game played in 1996 between Hasan Gatin and Fabisovic. That game went bishop e3, white developing and hitting this pawn on c5, b6, knight bd2. I also saw Alex Yermolinsky. He covered this position in his recap for chess.com, and he seemed a little skeptical of Black's chances here, but I think compared to the game continuation, this is a better option, hindsight being 2020. It looks, let's say Black plays knight e7 here, it looks harder for white to carry out the b4 move, White could think about it as a pawn sacrifice at this point, some line like this, and then trying to play either d4 directly, go after the e5 pawn, or maybe even knight c4, try to put pressure on b6 and e5. This looks scary, but the computer was indicating that black was actually doing okay here. b4 is not strictly forced. White could also maybe play c3 and try to prepare it, or maybe play strategically knight c4. But I think compared to the game, this is more appealing. So a5 would have been my choice in this position. But Magnus develops and he plays knight f6. So much like in game 1, I think he had in mind this eventual maneuver of the knight to d7 versus putting the knight on e7, which we just saw in that game fragment. Because Alex Yermolinsky points out that with the knight on e7, it doesn't have a lot of prospects because it's kind of taken away by this pawn on e4. So Magnus prefers knight f6 here, and Fabiano goes ahead and plays b4. And now Magnus played his next move very quickly, 35 seconds. So he just castled. He did not address the pawn tension at all. So almost daring Fabiano to take on c5. And this proved to be a pivotal point in this game because Fabiano spent 11 minutes now, which was his longest think of the game, and he didn't take. He didn't take Magnus up on that offer, which just on the surface of it feels like a kind of a failure if you can't capture that pawn right away. And I get the sense that Magnus is kind of goading Fabiano into making tough decisions early on in the game. So I don't know if that was part of Magnus's psychology in playing castles very quickly, or if he was still in his prep. I mean, very possible he was just still in his prep here, or had looked at similar positions. But b takes c5 is definitely the critical move. But interestingly, I'm going to reference that game 2 game again with rook d8. There, Magnus admitted in a press conference that he didn't play the critical move, which was knight d2. So he's kind of trying to turn the tables here and dare Fabiano to take on c5. So if white does take on c5, there's a number of ways black can play here, but the most direct would be to try to regain this pawn. So knight d7, I think, is probably the best way to attempt to do this. Other possibilities, like you could just develop like bishop e6, maybe trying to make way for knight d7 later when it doesn't block the bishop. Queen e7 could be played, looking to play queen takes c5, but I think after a4, black's going to have to go through some contortions and put a lot of pieces on this diagonal if they want to win the pawn back, because note, queen takes c5, bishop a3, and that rook on f8 will be a goner. So black would have to play knight d7, bishop a3, knight takes c5. This just looks very uncomfortable with the pin here. So probably the critical line is knight d7, and now white can support the pawn with bishop e3. And f5, this was analyzed by a lot of people here, f5 trying to introduce the threat of f4. But I think white has a couple ways to deal with this. f4 is significant, by the way, because the bishop would have to move, and then black presumably could take the pawn back on c5. I just had to look at a couple possibilities here. Knight g5 seems kind of interesting in this position, threatening knight e6. And if black were to play, let's say, the knight back to f6, maybe white plays a move like c3, opening up queen b3. With the knight no longer on d7, black can't hope to regain this pawn anytime soon. I'm not convinced that black has enough compensation here, although f4 is in the air. But another idea is to play a4 after f5. Let black play this f4 move and then kind of do this pendulum swing with the bishop. Bishop back to c1, knight takes c5, bishop a3. Again, unpleasant pin situation, and if black defends with, say, b6, white can develop and then eventually take on c5 and give black these double isolated c-pawns. And this would be an interesting scenario, white having the traditionally weaker two knights against the two bishops, but with the position being pretty closed, and if white can hold black off on the king side, I mean, white's probably better here because these weaknesses are pretty significant. White has nice ways to maneuver, maybe with knight c4 in the future, targeting this pawn too at some point. So b takes c5, definitely the critical move, but Fabiano thinks for 11 minutes and doesn't dare to take that pawn. So he plays knight bd2. And Magnus could capture on b4, but he plays bishop g4. I should mention a couple moves back here. So after b4, looking at the database again, there was one game where black did take on b4. So if you're wondering why Magnus is just letting black take here, it's not a forced decision to castle. There was this game played, Bazant versus Mudrak in 2007, a 2200 versus a 2300, and black did take, white recaptured here, But I think this is kind of pleasant for white, just showing how the game went. White put the bishop on b2, the knight on d2, played his bishop to c3, which is helpful because he could play queen b1 to queen b2, exercising a lot of pressure against e5. And after c5, white pushed b5, and then got his knight to c4, and white had a nice grip on the position and a definite advantage. So, black could play in that fashion, but I think Magnus realized that that capture on b4 does give white some nice strategic pressure. But going forward again, after castles and Fabiano passing up that key capture on c5, knight bd2, bishop g4. White plays h3. Again, could think about taking here, although I think it's less appealing than on the previous move. Black could play knight d7 once again, and here, note that white can't play bishop e3 to defend the pawn, so the only logical way to defend the pawn is knight b3. But now this f5 move is even better for black, I think, than the previous line, because the bishop is already developed out here to g4. Black can look to take on e4 and get the rook involved. Yeah, I don't think white really wants to get involved in this position. So on bishop g4, Fabiano again persists in avoiding b takes c5. He just plays h3. Magnus takes on f3. Note that bishop h5 is a very bad idea because of g4. And actually, in general, you should be a little cautious about playing a pin move like that when you fianchettoed a bishop on the same side of the board. Because of this exact reason, when your opponent kicks your bishop with the rook pawn, if you do retreat, you're often running into g4 because you got a pawn here, as you built that fianchetto. So Magnus knows that. He takes the knight on f3. Fabiano recaptures. And now Magnus finally does take on b4, but you can see that he was able to clarify the position a little bit and get a trade in bishop g4, take on f3, and he didn't have to give up a pawn. So this trade happens, and then maybe due to these binding ideas that I mentioned in that Bazant game, Magnus was looking to break right away, so he played a5, which I think is a good decision. That pawn on b4 is being pretty annoying, controlling key squares. If white gets a little more organized, either bishop e3 or bishop b2, as in that aforementioned game, then it looks like white's going to have some nice long-term pressure with these pawns being relatively immobile. So Magnus plays a5 and says, look, let's liquidate these pawns right away. Fabiano takes with the pawn. Rook takes. And now Fabiano plays a little listlessly in this next sequence of moves. And he admitted it in the press conference that he didn't play this in the best way. So he played bishop d2 here. But he should have captured on a5 immediately. Rook takes a5 was just a better move. And if rook takes a5 had been played, the reason is queen takes a5. Now he can play bishop d2 with tempo. And the queen has to stay guarding the e5 pawn. So queen to c7. And now he could take the a-file, queen a1. Nice little move. Take the a-file. Also, white has two attackers on a5. And Magnus was mentioning in the press conference that he thought he was going to be defending for a while here. Knight d7. White is not clearly better or anything. It's just kind of a nagging advantage. But black has slightly worse pieces. Black has two pawn islands against white's one, which is a big theme of this game. You'll see later on, actually, that kind of helps black. But with white having control of the a-file, the ability to swing the rook over, I think white's comfortably better here. One move that looks appealing to me, if this position were to be reached, is queen a7, which stops black from playing b5. Maybe you can continue with rook b1, bishop to c3, put pressure here. It's a little annoying. Maybe even bishop a5 as well, supported by the queen. So something to play for, at least. But Fabiano plays bishop d2, and you'll see why this is inaccurate in a second. If black were to take on a1, then we get very much the same scenario we just looked at. White gets to recapture, takes the file, forces black to defend e5. But Magnus smartly plays rook a to a8. He goes backwards. And we have this standoff on the a-file. And now if white were to take, black can recapture with the rook, leave the queen stationary guarding the pawn here, and black would have the a-file and white wouldn't. So an interesting file situation there that did not work out in Fabiano's favor. He plays queen b1. Magnus plays this rerouting move, knight d7. And here too, I think this next move, I don't really understand the purpose of it. He plays queen b4. So maybe Fabiano played this move with an eye towards going queen e7 in the future, but he never pulls the trigger on queen e7, so I kind of question whether the queen is even good on the b4 square. It does connect the rooks, but yeah, queen b2 seemed like a better destination for the queen. And white always has this idea of playing bishop c3, attacking e5 multiple times. And also this connects the rooks too, and possibly prepares for rook takes a8 followed by rook a1, whereas queen b4 doesn't. So queen b4, Magnus plays rook fe8, useful semi-waiting move. So in situations like this where there's only one truly open file, you usually do not want to be the first one to take because you surrender that file. Hopefully that's clear by now, but that's what goes into the decision making in these past few moves. If black were to take, then white gets what he wants, which is control the file. So there's the standoff going. That's why neither side is wanting to be the first one to blink. Although that rook takes a5 move was good because we were winning time on the queen. So Magnus plays rook fe8. This just guards the e7 square. Also, maybe he can play bishop f8 in the future. Fabiano plays bishop c3, putting pressure here. And now Magnus plays b5, gaining a little space on the queen side. Fabiano captures. So he opts to let black recapture and thereby take the file. And now Fabiano continues with rook a1, which makes a lot of sense if your goal was just to get the rooks off the board. You see this very often when there's 4 rooks, 1 open file. At some point, someone will decide to make the capture first, and rather than letting the opponent have the file, they'll bring the other rook over, and we just get this liquidation, trade the rooks. It would be interesting to try queen e7 here, because I speculated maybe that's the reason Fabiano played queen b4. But this is kind of an entertaining line. This just shows why queen e7 doesn't amount to much. Bishop f6, attacking the queen. And if you have to go back to b4, that's just kind of sad. But there is this nice move, bishop takes e5, trying to use the pin on the knight on d7. And there's this somewhat forced sequence, bishop takes e5, knight takes e5, queen takes e5, queen takes d7, white has won a pawn. But that's not the end of the road. Black can play rook a1. And if we get a trade of rooks, check, king h2, queen back to e5 check. If white wants to keep the game going, they pretty much have to play g3. And now there's this move queen c5 at the end, which is very nice for black, attacking 2 pawns and also defending this pawn on c6. White has absolutely nothing here. It's going to have to give the pawn back. So queen e7 probably crossed Fabiano's mind, like it is kind of an attractive move, trying to pin this knight, maybe even with an inkling to play knight g5 and go after f7, but doesn't look like it's working. So Fabiano just plays rook a1, and we get the rooks off the board. Magnus plays queen a7, attacking the bishop here on a1. Fabiano plays bishop c3. And now Magnus brings the queen into a2, attacking the base of the pawn chain, this pawn on c2. And here Fabiano plays this move that he probably should have played earlier instead of queen b4, just queen b2, offering a queen trade, creating this queen-bishop battery against e5. Once again, queen e7. If this move could be played, it's really nice. It's an active move. Hits the now undefended knight. But black can take that pawn on c2, and black has the counterattack on c3. So I don't see this working out in white's favor. Just one example line. Queen takes d7, queen takes c3, queen e8 check, bishop f8. But what is the follow-up here for white? Going after f7 is, again, appealing, but knight g5 actually just loses the knight after check. Go pick it up. Black now has this outside pawn, too, so if white doesn't have something concrete here, I don't think white should go for this. So I think Fabiano correctly realized queen e7 isn't leading anywhere, so he comes back and proposes this trade. Magnus agrees to the trade. Now we have this endgame with equal material. And, it's kind of tempting to gloss through this stage of the game. I definitely did that in game 1 with that rook endgame, where there were like 50-plus moves played, 3 hours of play or something, and nothing really changed the evaluation. I think this is a little more interesting because we do have more imbalances to examine. And the position is not close to a theoretical draw or anything yet. Should be drawn with best play, but Magnus plays f6, reinforcing e5. Fabiano plays king f1, king f7, both sides getting a little closer to the center with their king. King e2, knight c5, bishop c3, and now knight e6. This is a nice square for the knight, influencing a lot of forward squares. So I think black is a little more comfortable in this endgame. And I will tell you why, or attempt to tell you why. So white does have one uninterrupted pawn chain, whereas black has 2 pawn islands. Now, usually that's better for the side with less pawn islands. Generally, you want less pawn islands. But in the endgame, the potential for an outside pass pawn can often bring about an advantage for one side, the side that can create that outside pass pawn. So the fact that black has this b pawn, which is the furthest most pawn to the left side of the board, if you will, looking at it from white's perspective, that means white has to be kind of careful not to allow black to create a pass pawn later on. Also, I think black's structure is a little more flexible in general. It's hard to see how white's going to ever break in a meaningful way. White has this bishop on c3 blocking their c pawn temporarily, whereas you'll see black does have some pawn breaks like f5 later. So black's pawns are a little more flexible. Black has this outside pawn, which in some cases, if white's not careful, could become a pass pawn. So that's why black's a little bit better. Doesn't really have anything to do with the pieces. I mean, the piece situations are going to be kind of temporary as far as which piece is better than which piece. It's no imbalance, just 2 minor pieces, bishop and a knight each. But it really boils down to the pawns. So white played g3 here, so guarding the f4 square. Magnus plays bishop f8. This move, again, maybe a little bit of goading. White has the option of sacrificing a piece for 3 pawns here, which is very interesting. Playing bishop takes e5, f takes e5, knight takes e5 check, king e7, and then go pick up this pawn. But I think Fabiano was wise not to go for this. This doesn't really seem in the spirit of the way that these guys have been playing so far, too. But even though the pawns are all connected, I think after king d7, knight e5 check, king d6, this is a line that Alex Yermolinsky also analyzed in his chess.com recap. I think it's an important line. f4, trying to connect the pawns and defend the knight. Bishop g7, knight back to f3, king c5. Really only white is risking something here because, again, black retains this b pawn. So white does have somewhat of a hard time advancing these in a coherent way. At all times, white has to entertain what happens if black plays knight d4. You got to guard c2 with your life because if you lose c2 if you're white, then this pawn runs. So I don't think Fabiano wanted to get involved with this at all. Even though 3 connected pawns for a piece is usually a pretty good bargain. And here, by the way, I think king d7, if this line were to occur, is better than king d6. Because king d6 allows white to use this b4 square and maybe swing the knight to d5, which I think is an improvement. Whereas with king d7, we're guarding the b4 square with the bishop. So hence why I was looking at check, king d6, f4, and then black trying to kind of cut over towards the queen side. So that was a possibility after bishop f8, but Fabiano didn't go for it. He just played knight d2 here. Magnus played knight g5, goading this pawn forward, h4. But with white playing h4, even though usually this kind of helps you with the pawns all defending, it does give black something to nibble on in the future if ever g5 could be played. There's a line I'll show in a second where that is significant. So Fabiano plays knight b3, and now h5 from Magnus. Bishop back to d2. Fabiano's pretty much just waiting here. He does gain some flexibility with the c pawn. He can try to put it on c3 by virtue of moving the bishop from c3. Bishop d6, and he does play c3. Okay, so here, after c5 by Magnus, is where you can kind of see how this b pawn may become passed in some scenarios. So if ever black plays b4 and there's a swap, suddenly that pawn could gain in value if you're black. Because white might have to assign a piece like this knight on b3 to constantly defend against it advancing. That is a big decision for black because the pawn could also become weak. Just because a pawn is passed doesn't automatically mean it's strong. If that pawn could be blockaded and then attacked, it could be weak. But the mere fact that white has to think about that and black doesn't have like a complementary decision to have to think about and sweat over, that means that black's a little more comfortable here. Bishop e3. King e7. Magnus tries to get his king over a little bit. Note that if b4 is played, white doesn't have to take the pawn. White could play king d2 and try to get black to take here. And that's where this pawn could become weak. It's not even a pass pawn because this pawn on d3 is stopping it from advancing. But you don't want this scenario if you're black because now the king could come up to c4 and white might gang up on c5. So it can't be in too much of a hurry to push. Magnus just plays king e7. Fabiano goes king d1, king d7. They both make some movements towards this side of the board. And now here, Magnus could switch his attention back over to the king side, and indeed he does. He plays f5. It would also be interesting to play g5 here, kind of in the same spirit as b4 on the other wing. So you can see that black is trying to stretch white's defenses. Remember, I was talking about principle of two weaknesses in one of the other recaps, game 1, I believe. So given that white is putting most of his pieces on the queen side and especially bringing his king over here, g5 does make sense, because if white were to take on g5, black gets to take with the f-pawn, and now this pawn is passed. And white might have to stage a retreat to try to get over to stop it, maybe use his knight even. But I think the problem is g5 doesn't really threaten much. We have this option of taking, but if white plays a move like f3, just ensures that if takes, we're never giving this passed pawn to black, then hard to see what black is going to do here, unless they could outright win h4, which seems tough. But you can see that black has some nibbles in the position with b4 or g5. Magnus chooses a slightly different path with f5. So making use of his pawn advance, challenging Fabiano to take, but taking isn't necessary. Fabiano plays a waiting move, king d1. Maybe he wanted to give his king access to both sides of the board. It can make an appearance on either wing if necessary. And now Magnus played f takes e4. Some people were criticizing this move. It does seem a little rushed. It feels like Magnus and his wonderful technique dictates playing this position a little more slowly and trying to squeeze more out of it. But in the press conference, he didn't really think that he had much here. I think he pretty much admitted that this position was headed towards a draw. But I just looked at a possible line f4 if black wanted to advance here, just trying to create some sort of imbalance. If white takes on f4 now, black can take with the pawn, bishop moves, and then this g5 move comes up again, this time forcing white to take. And once more, black has this outside pass pawn. So that would be a nice scenario for black. Black would have winning chances there. But on f4, Fabiano wouldn't have to cooperate. He could play bishop c1. I did look at a semi-forced line here, c4, if black wants to try to continue playing this in a forced fashion. And now knight a5, I think, makes the most sense, trying to attack this pawn without blocking the bishop, not putting the knight on d2. And then there could be a trade on g3. And black might go after the e4 pawn in return. So threatening knight takes e4. If knight takes c4, knight takes e4, and both of these pawns are hit. But I think by some admittedly passive but solid moves, Fabiano can maintain close to equality here. Bishop d2, let black take on e4, then play bishop e1. The bishop is on the back rank, but it's supporting these pawns. And white is ready to play knight takes c4 next. And black's probably a little bit better even here, just greater activity. White's got two pieces on the back rank. Black's king, if you're white, you have to make sure it doesn't dart in somewhere and go after these pawns. But this should still be a draw, some position like this. But I say this because I think black could try to press a little bit more here. F takes e4, on the other hand, quickly fizzles. So maybe f4 or even some other constructed move, moving the king perhaps, could be an idea. So f takes e4, d takes e4. So now we have majorities on opposite sides of the board. There is a 2 versus 1 over here, but in return, Fabiano gets a majority. Magnus plays c4, attacking the knight, knight d2, and now knight c5. Good square for the knight, but Fabiano just takes it before black even has a chance to get into a square like d3 or coming over to a4 to attack that c3 pawn. So Fabiano gives up the bishop for the knight. I've seen Magnus play some really wonderful bishop versus knight endgames, including one where he won against Vallejo Pons, who's one of Spain's top players. It's a fantastic game. I believe in the Peart's defense, or a Hanahan Philidor maybe. I'll link that. You can see his technique. But unfortunately, this imbalance alone is not enough for him to do any damage here. There's not enough resources left. Fabiano plays king e2 and defends this pawn. Because normally a bishop versus a knight, the bishop would be slightly for choice if there's pawns on both sides of the board. But white really only has one weakness, which is c3, and it's so tough for black to get at it without allowing counter pressure against e5, or maybe white playing f4 and getting a pass pawn going. So king c6, knight f1. This has in mind the idea of getting the knight to e3 and then possibly improving it further, knight d5. Magnus pushes b4, thereby allowing Fabiano to trade off this weakness. But if black were to wait, let's say bishop b6, once this knight comes to e3, I don't think these pawn endgames are ever good for black. Bishop takes e3, king takes e3. For instance, if king c5, f4, white can make a pass pawn, take. White has this protected pass pawn, and black can try to create a pass pawn here, but white gets back in time with their king. Only black would be risking losing this position. So I think maybe he didn't want this knight to come here and realize that the capture on e3 wouldn't favor him. So Magnus plays b4. He does give himself a pass pawn, but the knight does come here and attacks this pawn. King c5 is played. Note that if the pawn advances too quickly, king d3, white can easily corral it. That pawn is not getting to c2 with the king and the knight defending. Again, probably black is the only one who risks losing this position with knight d5. So he plays king c5, maybe thinking about sneaking the king up through d4 as well. But Magnus plays Fabiano plays f4. We get a trade of pawns. Bishop a5. Nice little move because bishop d8 could be on the cards, trying to go after this pawn on h4. But now Fabiano found a way to bring this game to a conclusion. Again, I think both players knew this was headed for a draw. They've been playing very fast the second half of the game. Haven't talked a lot about the time management in this game because aside from those opening nuances and that 11-minute think that Fabiano had deciding whether to take on c5, both players have been playing pretty fast. No big time pressure this game. So Fabiano played f5. Magnus took, and then Fabiano captured on c4. He sacrifices his knight for the pawn, which might be a surprising move if you're a relatively new player to chess. But the point is, after king takes c4, e takes f5, which happened, the players agree to draw, because even if black manages to win these pawns, which black will, you can't win the position because black has the wrong color bishop for promoting on this color. And what I mean by that is, let's just say black comes over and white just gives black the pawn, and white doesn't even put up a fight and gives black the h-pawn too. White's going to hang out in this h1 corner, and black can never kick him out of that because he has a dark square bishop. We can make some further moves, something like this. Pawn comes up, king g1. So if black were to play h2 here, king h1, there's no move black can make that will either not allow... There's no move that black can make that will not allow a stalemate or white to win the pawn on the next move. So king h3 is stalemate, or if the king goes somewhere else or there's a bishop move, well, bishop move would be a stalemate, but white can take this pawn. So just have to make sure that you stay in the corner. You wouldn't want to play, let's say this position came up and black gave a check. Of course, you wouldn't want to play king f1 here and allow black to play h2 and promote the pawn. Just stay in the corner. That threat of stalemate is always your friend. And despite the material advantage, black cannot win. So that's why the players agree to draw right here. Black has the wrong bishop to promote this rook pawn on h1. If the pawn were any pawn but a rook pawn, this would be winning for black if they can preserve this pawn. But that's a special case with a rook pawn and a wrong color bishop. So a 49 move draw. And again, probably the critical moment was in the opening. The rest of the game is worth analyzing, but big decision right here after castles by Magnus played in 35 seconds, whether to take this pawn on c5 if you're Fabiano, and Fabiano didn't do it. And it probably was the best decision. Again, I don't see how black gets full compensation after this. Black has to go through some contortions. There's some interesting lines. I'm sure we would have had a pitched battle there. But instead, we got all these trades, and after Magnus played a5, and especially after Fabiano did not play rook takes a5, followed by bishop d2, and instead played, that possibly wishy-washy move queen b4, and we swapped all the rooks. By the time they got here, if anyone's better, it's black. But even then, it wasn't enough to really do anything. But nonetheless, a long game and some interesting stuff to discuss. I hope some of the points that I elaborated on are useful in your own chess improvement. I'm trying to go for that a little bit. I will be back with Game 4 analysis tomorrow. And on Wednesday, which is November 14th, I'll be doing the rest day coverage on my Twitch channel at 12 o'clock p.m., noon Central Time, 1800 GMT, if you want to tune in. So thank you guys. I know you have a lot of options as far as which videos and streams you want to check out. I definitely recommend that you check out a wide variety of streams relating to this match. There's a ton of good content out there, but if you've waited for my video, I appreciate it. Thanks for your viewership, and I'll talk to you guys again soon. Hopefully we'll see a very entertaining game in Game 4. I think all these games have been pretty entertaining, honestly. But I understand that people, they always get sick of the draws after there's been a few draws to open a World Championship match. So, maybe we'll get a decisive game soon. So thanks again, guys, and I'll talk to you with the Game 4 analysis. Bye.